Blog Talk Radio.
Hello, everyone. I want to welcome all of you back to Ohio Exopolitics. I'm your host, Mark Snyder. I'm going to start out the study this evening talking about the first incarnated personality of Billy Edward Albert Meyer is a spirit form and a human being by the name of Nokodemion. Nokodemion is a very, very ancient spirit form that can be traced through this genealogy that's documented in the Meyer material. Nokodemion first incarnated 9.6 thousand million years ago, and it was called the unblemished precious one for whatever reason. The second incarnation of the spirit form was Henoch, which was about 8,000 million years ago, known as the wise man of time, the initiate. Nokodemion incarnated as Semyasa 389,000 years ago and fathered Adam. Now, 389,000 years ago was the date when the Lyrians were first here, and there are several million Lyrians. They violated certain creational natural laws when they were here. One of those violations was the abuse of the native earth peoples. So they entered into a kind of agreement where some of these Lyrians stayed behind and became spirit forms that were incarnating on Earth over the centuries. But Nokodemion is the same spirit form that incarnated as Edward Albert Meyer. But the Meyer material traces his spirit form back to these very, very, very ancient times. He also incarnated as Semyasa, and that occurred roughly 11 or 13,000 years ago. Again, Semyasa, the second Semyasa, fathered the second Adam. There were actually two Adams, one at about 13,000 years ago, another one at 389,000 years ago. Then the Nokodemion spirit form incarnated as Henoch, Henoch 1, about 13,500 years ago, Henoch 2, about 9,300 years ago, Henoch 3, 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, and then as Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Emmanuel, Muhammad, and then finally as Billy Edward Albert Meyer. Billy means the protector, Edward means the guardian of the treasure, Albert means the shining one, and Meyer means supervisor, practicing, respected, the higher standing. The acronym for Billy Edward Albert Meyer is BEAM. So that's a very quick, brief overview of the Nokodemion lineage. Now, Nokodemion, this spirit form, had gone through all the stages, all the 7 stages of human life. The 7 stages are primitive life, rational life, intelligent life, real life, life in creational wisdom, life in the half-spirit body, life in the purely spiritual form. It takes a spirit 60 to 80 billion years to evolve back into the pure spirit form. Remember, we talked about these stages in Contact Report 3, but I often bring them back up because they're so relevant. Now, before humans enter into the 7th stage of evolution, they reside in the 6th stage, which is half spirit and half physical. This occurs after about 40 to 60 million years. The spirit no longer requires a purely material body and becomes a half-spirit body. When the human resides in a half-spirit body, they're said to be in the sixth stage of evolution. Now, Nokodemion, this spirit form, has evolved into three important levels here. First of all, to the Ishwish level, which is ancient Lyrian for King of Wisdom. Some of the other Ishwishes that we've talked about before are Ptah, Pelagon, Jehovan, Atlant, Eris. This term applies only to men. The term for women is Ishrish, and the abbreviation for Ishwish is JHWH. Now, at the fifth stage, people usually become Ishwish if they're going to become an Ishwish. I'm not sure everyone goes through this stage. Maybe they do. And then, after the fifth stage of evolution, people move to the half-spiritual forms. Now, human beings can evolve to this what's called the Srut level, S-R-U-T. Ptah was an Ishwish in 2007. Remember, Ptah is the commander of the Plarian mothership. He received the first degree of the Srut level around 2007. The Ban Srut is the highest form of all wisdom that can be achieved by humans in regard to the creational natural laws. So this very highly evolved spirit form that the extraterrestrials know as Nokodemion has incarnated on Earth as Enoch, Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Emmanuel, Muhammad, and then Billy Edward Albert Meyer, a humble farmer from Switzerland, who right around, I think, 2008, wrote this book called The Goblet of Truth, which is providing information associated with something called the teaching of the Spirit. Now, when Thoth was a very young boy, when Billy was a very young boy, he had his first contacts with Thoth. And Thoth was Billy's first extraterrestrial mentor, and he told the people of the earth, Billy, that eventually Billy would become a teacher. And one of the things that Thoth did is he took Billy into his ship, sent him up high above the earth, about 70,000 meters, and he put a device on Billy's head to unlock the wisdom of his predecessor personalities, like Henoch, the three Henochs that we talked about, and Nokodemion, so that Billy could more efficiently teach these ancient universal teachings. So Billy had preparation for 11 years from Thoth, preparation for 11 years by a woman named Asket from the Tao universe, and then eventually met with Semyasi, who was the granddaughter of Thoth, and he had multiple years of preparation meeting with her. Eventually, the official contacts ended. The Plarian left the Earth in 1995. They wouldn't tell us why, but at that time they revealed their true identity. They allowed themselves to be called the Pleiadians before that time, but they don't reside in our Pleiades. They reside in a different space-time configuration, some 80 light years beyond our Pleiades. But they left behind this very ancient spirit who they visit about once a year now. And one of the things that Thoth taught Billy was something called spiritual telepathy, which allows Edward Albert Meyer to pull down information from this pure spiritual level called Arahat Athrasata that we just talked about. And some of the Goblet of the Truth, the book Goblet of Truth, is probably inspired by the Arahat Athrasata level. And I always go back to the paragraph that's entitled, What the Truth Knows to Say. It says, respect or venerability towards the entirety of nature and towards the creation and its laws and recommendations must determine the human being's thoughts and feelings and his or her deeds. Respect means a feeling of deep admiration for something. Venerability means commanding respect because of the great age or impressive dignity. And it goes on to explain that human beings must live in harmony with creation, with nature, with earth and the universe, as well as all the varieties of present existence that spring forth from these. And then it goes on to say rivers, stones, plants, animals, lakes, seas, books, the air and water, trees and bushes, and everything that crawls and flies on the earth are life forms with a spirit form, with very many of them being connected by psychic swinging waves. Now, the swinging waves are mentioned more than once in the Goblet of the Truth, and they're very important, I think, to understand what is going on inside the human spirit. Remember, we all have a human spirit. It resides in your midbrain. The human spirit is no larger than the head of a pin, but it animates every cell in your body. The human spirit is the real you. And the human spirit incarnates many, many times in different physical bodies with different personalities. The human spirit was created by the universal consciousness to help it in its own evolutionary level. See, the purpose of our life is evolution, to gain wisdom. And in fact, our whole material universe is and comes from the wisdom of this universal consciousness that the extraterrestrials sometimes refer just to as creation. Now, creation has both a spiritual superintelligence associated with it as well as a physical structure. And part of the physical structure of creation involves things like the natural world. And when you go into the forest, you can hear these creatures as they communicate with one another. They are connected by psychic vibrations. And you can hear the crickets and the birds and the cicadas and all these forms of life that are part of a web, of a indissoluble web of life. And it talks about a tightly woven web of life. That's what the physical creation consists of. And something that's woven is interlaced, like threads of yarn, like fabric, a material, which is interlaced by crossing one over another. And this web of life that you can see most easily by going into the forest is indissoluble, which means it's stable, unless we tamper with it, unless we destroy pieces of it. This tightly woven and indissoluble web of life contains a basic goodness and not evil. Now, evil is something that's learned, and evil comes from something called Asartung in German, which means to get very badly out of control of the good human nature. Now, what has happened in our society is that we have gotten out of control of the good human nature. And now our society has turned into an aberration, which means we're no longer following the normal creational path of evolution. And because of that, we have things like nationalism, fascism, neo-capitalism, cynical materialism. And the Goblet of Truth warns us about these things, and it says, irrespective of what is involved, whether simple or fanatical religions and sects, stubborn nationalism. Let me talk a little bit about fanatical religions and how they manifest themselves. First of all, a fanatic often has intense, uncritical devotion. And if you managed to listen to the first hour of Revolution Radio last night when I was on with Frosty Wooldridge, he talked about one of the practices of Islam. Now, I don't know that all people in Islam do this. I certainly hope not. Frosty thinks that it is a common practice. I personally don't know, but it's the mutilation of the vagina and the clitoris of young girls. They cut the clitoris out with a razor blade or with glass. Horrible things, and they cut other parts of the vagina out. It's an extreme and dangerous practice of a fanatical religion. Now, a sect is a philosophical or political group that's regarded as extreme or dangerous. And now in our governments, we have the rise of fascism. Fascism can be defined as a governmental system led by a dictator having complete power, forcibly suppressing opposition and criticism. And we also have something called capitalism, which is operated for profit and can be entirely privately owned. Now, all of these things that I've described are part of this aberration. An aberration is the act of departing from the right, normal, and usual course. So I suppose our religions, fascism, neo-capitalism, are departing from what is right and an immense threat to the people of the earth. And now we're headed towards a catastrophe. We're heading towards what they call the third millennium. Actually, we're in it. We're heading towards a whole series of prophecies that were given in the Enoch prophecies, the most disturbing of which states that in North America will be the greatest disaster in recorded history when nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons are released by automated systems which run outside of human control. This is one of the catastrophes that could occur in the third millennium. We have seen catastrophes like Fukushima. But what is bringing about these catastrophes are things like cynical materialism, unbridled neo-capitalism, which have overtaken the entire world and are leading to extremely serious damage in nature. These philosophies also damage the morality of human beings on Earth. And overpopulation. Last night we talked about overpopulation and the devastation that it's bringing to the earth. Now, I just read something there that said cynical materialism and unbridled capitalism have overtaken the entire world. Cynics are people motivated by self-interest, distrust of human sincerity or integrity. Materialism is the tendency to consider material possessions and physical comfort as more important than spiritual values. So we're heading to a primitive anarchy. We're heading towards a global collapse, towards an apocalypse of sorts. Now, apocalypse can have two meanings. One, any universal or widespread disaster. And two, any class of Jewish and Christian writings which were said to be about these apocalyptic events. Now, the Meyer material, the Goblet of Truth, states that these global disasters that are coming really started all the way back in the founding of the Roman Catholic Church and the Roman Empire. So we can trace our disasters all the way back to the Roman Catholic Church and the Roman Empire. What is the Roman Empire? The Roman Empire is described as despotic in the Goblet of Truth. The Roman Empire was the post-Republican period of the ancient Roman civilization, characterized by a government headed by emperors and large territorial holdings around the Mediterranean Sea in Europe, Africa, and Asia. Now, there was something called the Pax Romana, the Peace of Rome. It lasted for a couple centuries, and it involved a great political stability. But eventually, the Roman Empire was gradually eroded by abuses of power, civil wars, barbarous migrations and invasions, military reforms, economic depression. Sounds like the United States, if you ask me. The sack of Rome occurred in 410 by the Visigoths and again in 455 AD by the Vandals, marking the beginning of the end of the Roman Empire in the West. Now, how have the Roman Catholic Church and the Roman Empire led to the demise of our civilization? Well, the Goblet of Truth says that these two institutions have created a consciousness-conditioned tyranny. So what does that mean, a consciousness-conditioned tyranny? To condition means to bring something into the desired state for use. So something is going to use us. So they're conditioning us so they can use us. Now, what is consciousness? Our consciousness is a state of being awake and aware of our surroundings. Our minds, our awareness is being conditioned into a desired state for use by this tyranny which sprang out of the Roman Empire and the Roman Catholic Church. And what they're doing is they're moving us into a state of servitude. Servitude meaning to be a slave or a subject to someone that is more powerful. It's really interesting the way the Goblet of Truth is laying all this information out, and how it traces it all back to the Roman Empire. And I'm sure you can see how this is in fact affecting us today. Let me play just a little bit of this clip that talks about the story of the Roman Empire.
This is ancient Rome, the heartbeat of an empire, birthplace of one of the greatest civilizations on Earth. Written in stone, its ruins tell a remarkable story. It's the world's first metropolis, erected of concrete and marble, built on a swamp with extraordinary engineering. Buried beneath modern streets are the pillars of Rome's power, inspired by ambition and driven by innovation. Today, archaeologists are piecing together newly found fragments of a city and of a people who profoundly influenced the world. It's the first civilization to conquer the Western world, and at its peak, it is the greatest empire on Earth. Spanning 3 continents and 2 million square miles, it rules 60 million people. But Rome's greatest feat is that its endurance and its supremacy lasts for centuries.
When we think of Rome, of the Roman emperors, the Romans themselves viewed their city already as ancient. Over 500 years of construction, destruction, and reconstruction had shaped the city.
Rome's long history is sacred, and Romans worship the goddess Roma, who personifies the city. But to fully understand the extraordinary accomplishments of Rome, we must examine how it all began.
Tradition has it that Rome was founded here, on the Palatine Hill, one of Rome's oldest hills. And it's right here that we have the remains of a hut that dates back to the 8th century BC.
There is a widely held belief that the city's founding fathers are Romulus and Remus, the semi-divine sons of the god Mars. To early Romans, this myth explains plenty. Like the engineering work that seems superhuman in its scale. Without it, Rome does not exist.
This is the Roman Forum. It's the commercial center of Rome. It's the political center. It's the religious center. It is the heart of the empire that spans the Mediterranean. Originally, it didn't look like this, though. Originally, it's wet, uninhabitable.
The tribal land of the Romans is a swamp, a breeding ground for diseases like malaria. No settlement can thrive here unless a large area is drained.
Rome didn't grow into an imperial world city because of its natural advantages. It was the Romans that made Rome, and not the location.
Major construction begins around 600 BC. An army of laborers cut channels. At first, they're just open drains, collecting water as it runs off the hills. Later, they are covered over and built on. These tunnels are so well made and robust that even today, some are still in use.
The way they go about making these kinds of drains is they start with the bedrock. So the lower courses, the lowermost courses, they're actually cutting right through the bedrock, the tuff of the hill of the Capitoline. Then on top of that, they take other blocks and they stack them up to make these walls.
Only recently have these drains been properly explored. Archaeologist Cristiano Ranieri is mapping all of the tunnels in the system. In every corner, in every crack, he finds something new.
Cristiano is examining this material, amphorae, ceramics, bones, and it just accumulates over time as people continue to dump them.
So the Roman Empire fell around 455 AD, but what sprang out of that was the Roman Catholic Church, which did things like the Inquisition. Let's talk a little bit about the Inquisition and what the Inquisition was. First of all, it talks about the imperium, the Roman imperium. It says, in particular, the Roman Catholic Church inherited the practices of the inhuman Roman imperium, establishing an evil consciousness conditioned tyranny. An imperium means an area of dominion, a sphere of control, or monopoly, an empire. An inquisition is an official investigation, especially one of political or religious nature. Now, when the Roman Catholic Church came into power, one of the things it did was the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition was designed to enforce the religious dogmas of Rome, of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, in the Spanish Inquisition, one of the punishments was what they called the auto de fe, where condemned heretics were burned at the stake. And some estimate that in the Spanish Inquisition, there were 31,912 people burned at the stake. And again, we're talking about the fact that this consciousness-conditioned tyranny was being formed. Consciousness, again, is our state of being awake and aware of our surroundings. To condition something means to bring something into the desired state. So this Roman Catholic Church brought people into their desired state, which was submission. And then this tyranny, this consciousness-conditioned tyranny, created a state where people were treated cruelly, unreasonably, and they used their power to enforce this. So I have another clip here that talks about the origin of the Roman Catholic Church.
This is ancient Rome, the heartbeat of an empire.
Well, looks like I don't actually have that. I may have gotten my clips confused as I uploaded things. That does happen. Let me look here just briefly, folks. Live radio here. Well, we'll keep moving. We'll definitely keep moving. I have a really interesting clip on the Roman Catholic Church that I'll have to re-upload for you at some time soon. Anyway, one of the things the Goblet of Truth traces is what's happened in our society. We've become an aberration. We've, through neo-capitalism, fascism, cynical materialism, we've left the normal path of evolution, and the clash of industrial nations is going to occur. It almost seems unavoidable at this point. And if we don't have the clash of the industrial nations, we'll have the breakdown of nature, the collapse of the natural world. See, we've desecrated nature. We've defiled nature. We've polluted nature. We've flouted nature. We've treated it with disdain, scorn, and contempt. Our civilization is wiping out nature. And this will eventually come back to haunt us. And we'll have primitive anarchy if we don't change the path we're on. And some of us will go into a vegetative existence. And we'll have an apocalypse. So the teaching of the Spirit is designed to keep us from repeating the apocalypses that have occurred twice before in ancient times. There was a man named Pelagon who came here from the Pleiadian star system about 150,000 years ago. He developed a civilization. He was a very benevolent king of wisdom and Ishwish. His civilization thrived for 2,000 years. And then eventually, when he died, the civilization started its death, which led to a world war, which was extremely devastating. In fact, some of the people escaped the earth, but the earth was avoided for 700 years before the descendants of the refugees came back, and these refugees had escaped to Beta Centauri. They had left the Earth and escaped to Beta Centauri. Now, Beta Centauri in our space-time configuration is a trinary star system in the southern constellation of Centaurus. It's about 350 light years away, so these were very, very advanced people. And this trinary star system has Beta Centauri A1, A2, and B, where Centauri A1 and A2 are giant stars that have exhausted their hydrogen. So, our Milky Way galaxy is 100,000 light years across. That means if you're in a spaceship going the speed of light, it would take you 100,000 years to get across. And there are different space-time configurations, different dimensions. And in some ways, I believe, just my own personal thought, that they mirror each other. They're similar in certain ways. There's a different Sirius system in a different space-time configuration. There's a different Beta Centauri system. And these extraterrestrials came from this other Beta Centauri system. And that way, they came to the Earth about 133,000 years ago. And they developed the great cities of Atlantis and Lemuria. Now, if you remember, Atlantis was an island continent that had been used before. So evidently, there have been many, I don't know how many civilizations there have been on our world. But they've risen and fallen for millennia. And Atlantis was reused, and there were two Ishwishes who came here, Atlant and Cryatide, man and wife, who developed the great city of Atlantis. Now, Cryatide's cousin, Muras, developed the gigantic city of Mu. And the city of Mu was said to be where our Gobi Desert is. The Gobi Desert is in northern China and in Mongolia. Mongolia is north of China and south of Russia. And the Gobi Desert is about 1,000 miles long. Underneath this gigantic city of Mu were two smaller cities, Agartha Alpha and Agartha Beta, that were connected by underground tunnels. These were very, very advanced human civilizations. That's why we look back in puzzlement on constructions like the Great Pyramid, which, if we were able to be honest with ourselves, we could easily see was built by a higher civilization than we are. It took great levels of knowledge about architecture and great tools to build structures out of stone. So these very advanced civilizations of Atlantis and Lemuria thrived for thousands of years, and scientists stirred up trouble. And I think this may be a bit of a reoccurring theme in history. We have scientific dictatorships being formed. Today we have a scientific dictatorship that's being formed. There are Google brain implants. There are Google cars which will drive themselves. The reason? So that they can control where you go. We don't need cars that drive themselves. There's maybe some practical reasons for these, and people get too old to drive themselves, but really it's designed to take away your freedom to take and bring in this scientific dictatorship that's occurred here probably in the ancient past as well. And I think the transhumanist movement is really an extension of materialism, an aberration. Remember, it's going off of the path of normal evolution. And that's where transhumanism is taking us, off the path of a normal and healthy evolution.
You know, when I became president in January of 1993, back in the dark ages, the average cell phone weighed 5 pounds. And there were 50 sites on the entire World Wide Web. 50. There have been more added than that since I've been talking.
God made man in his own image. God intended for man to become one with God. We are going to become one with God. Cloning and the reprogramming of DNA is the first serious step in becoming one with God.
This issue is going to dominate our global politics. This is the issue that will color the century as we merge with machines, and I think it's inevitable that we will.
It's inevitable that we will merge with machines. Now, the Minor Material and Contact Report 70 says that these scientists exalted themselves. They were whipped up by power lust, and they tried to snatch control for themselves. This time, they, however, had not reckoned the people's memory of war, which had been passed down over the ages. So before the scientists could strike, the people rose up against them. And through an accomplice, the scientists obtained possession of spaceships, and they fled back to Beta Centauri, into these space-time shifted regions. This was 115,000 years ago. Well, they spent 2,000 years, these scientists did, and they created a high technical standard. They produced many descendants, and they returned to the Earth filled with hate after they had increased their hate immeasurably against the extraterrestrial inhabitants of Earth. I don't understand this hatred. How can you hold on to hatred for 2,000 years? Anyway, they came back, and eventually they stirred up the great war between Atlantis and Lemuria. Now I have another clip here I find quite interesting. It's Rupert Sheldrake, and he's explaining some of the false statements of our science today. And I think it's important that we understand that our science doesn't know nearly what the scientists claim that they think they know. Let's listen to Rupert Sheldrake here. This is a very, very interesting report, and it talks about the delusion of science.
The science delusion is the belief that science already understands the nature of reality in principle, leaving only the details to be filled in. This is a very widespread belief in our society. It's the kind of belief system of people who say, I don't believe in God, I believe in science. It's a belief system which has now been spread to the entire world. But there's a conflict in the heart of science between science as a method of inquiry based on reason, evidence, hypothesis, and collective investigation, and science as a belief system or a worldview. And unfortunately, the worldview aspect of science has come to inhibit and constrict the free inquiry, which is the very lifeblood of the scientific endeavor. Since the late 19th century, science has been conducted under the aspect of a belief system or worldview, which is essentially that of materialism, philosophical materialism. And these sciences are now wholly owned subsidiaries of the materialist worldview. I think that as we break out of it, the sciences will be regenerated. What I do in my book, The Science Delusion, which is called Science Set Free in the United States, is take the 10 dogmas or assumptions of science and turn them into questions, seeing how well they stand up if you look at them scientifically. None of them stand up very well. What I'm going to do is first run through what these 10 dogmas are, and then I'll only have time to discuss one or two of them in a bit more detail. But essentially the 10 dogmas, which are the default worldview of most educated people all over the world, are first, that nature is mechanical or machine-like. The universe is like a machine. Animals and plants are like machines. We're like machines. In fact, we are machines. We're lumbering robots, in Richard Dawkins' vivid phrase, with brains that are genetically programmed computers. Second, matter is unconscious. The whole universe is made up of unconscious matter. There's no consciousness in stars, in galaxies, in planets, in animals, in plants, and there ought not to be any in us either, if this theory is true. So a lot of the philosophy of mind over the last 100 years is trying to prove that we're not really conscious at all. So the matter's unconscious, then the laws of nature are fixed. This is dogma 3. The laws of nature are the same now as they were at the time of the Big Bang, and they'll be the same forever. Not just the laws, but the constants of nature are fixed, which is why they are called constants. Dogma 4, the total amount of matter and energy is always the same. It never changes in total quantity, except at the moment of the Big Bang, when it all sprang into existence from nowhere in a single instant. The fifth dogma is that nature is purposeless. There are no purposes in all nature, and the evolutionary process has no purpose or direction. Dogma 6, biological heredity is material. Everything you inherit is in your genes, or in epigenetic modifications of the genes, or in cytoplasmic inheritance. It's material. Dogma 7, memories are stored inside your brain as material traces. Somehow everything you remember is in your brain in modified nerve endings, phosphorylated proteins. No one knows how it works, but nevertheless, almost everyone in the scientific world believes it must be in the brain. Dogma 8, your mind is inside your head. All your consciousness is the activity of your brain and nothing more. Dogma 9, which follows from Dogma 8, psychic phenomena like telepathy are impossible. Your thoughts and intentions cannot have any effect at a distance because your mind's inside your head. Therefore, all the apparent evidence for telepathy and other psychic phenomena is illusory. People believe these things happen, but it's just because they don't know enough about statistics, or they're deceived by coincidences, or it's wishful thinking. And Dogma 10, mechanistic medicine is the only kind that really works. That's why governments only fund research into mechanistic medicine and ignore complementary and alternative therapies. Those can't possibly really work because they're not mechanistic. They may appear to work because people would have got better anyway, or because of the placebo effect. But the only kind that really works is mechanistic medicine. Well, this is the default worldview, which is held by almost all educated people all over the world. It's the basis of the educational system, the National Health Service, the Medical Research Council, governments, and it's just the default worldview of educated people. But I think every one of these dogmas is very, very questionable, and when you look at it, they fall apart. I'm going to take first the idea that the laws of nature are fixed. This is a hangover from an older worldview before the 1960s, when the Big Bang Theory came in. People thought that the whole universe was eternal, governed by eternal mathematical laws. When the Big Bang came in, then that assumption continued, even though the Big Bang revealed a universe that's radically evolutionary, about 14 billion years old, growing and developing and evolving for 14 billion years, growing and cooling, and more structures and patterns appear within it. But the idea is all the laws of nature were completely fixed at the moment of the Big Bang, like a cosmic Napoleonic code. As my friend Terence McKenna used to say, modern science is based on the principle, give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest. And the one free miracle is the appearance of all the matter and energy in the universe and all the laws that govern it from nothing in a single instant. Well, in an evolutionary universe, why shouldn't the laws themselves evolve? After all, human laws do, and the idea of laws of nature is based on a metaphor with human laws. It's a very anthropocentric metaphor. Only humans have laws. In fact, only civilized societies have laws. As C.S. Lewis once said, to say that a stone falls to earth because it's obeying a law makes it a man and even a citizen. It's a metaphor that we've got so used to, we forget it's a metaphor. In an evolving universe, I think a much better idea is the idea of habits. I think the habits of nature evolve. The regularities of nature are essentially habitual. This was an idea put forward at the beginning of the 20th century by the American philosopher C.S. Peirce. And it's an idea which various other philosophers have entertained, and it's one which I myself have developed into a scientific hypothesis, the hypothesis of morphic resonance, which is the basis of these evolving habits. According to this hypothesis, everything in nature has a kind of collective memory. Resonance occurs on the basis of similarity. As a young giraffe embryo grows in its mother's womb, it tunes in to the morphic resonance of previous giraffes. It draws on that collective memory. It grows like a giraffe and it behaves like a giraffe because it's drawing on this collective memory. It has to have the right genes to make the right proteins, but genes, in my view, are grossly overrated. They only account for the proteins that the organism can make, not the shape or the form or the behavior. Every species has a kind of collective memory. Even crystals do. This theory predicts that if you make a new kind of crystal for the first time, the very first time you make it, it won't have an existing habit. But once it crystallizes, then the next time you make it, there'll be an influence from the first crystals to the second ones all over the world by morphic resonance. It'll crystallize a bit easier. The third time, there'll be an influence from the first and second crystals. There is, in fact, good evidence that new compounds get easier to crystallize all around the world, just as this theory would predict. It also predicts that if you train animals to learn a new trick, for example, rats learn a new trick in London, then all around the world, rats of the same breed should learn the same trick quicker just because the rats have learned it here. And surprisingly, there's already evidence that this actually happens. Anyway, that's my own hypothesis in a nutshell of morphic resonance. Everything depends on evolving habits, not on fixed laws. But I want to spend a few moments on the constants of nature too, because these are again assumed to be constant. Things like the gravitational constant, the speed of light, are called the fundamental constants. Are they really constant? Well, when I got interested in this question, I tried to find out. They're given in physics handbooks. Handbooks of physics list the existing fundamental constants, tell you their value. But I wanted to see if they'd changed. So I got the old volumes of physical handbooks. I went to the Patent Office Library here in London, and they're the only place I could find that kept the old volumes. Normally people throw them away when the new values come out. They throw away the old ones. When I did this, I found that the speed of light dropped between 1928 and 1945 by about 20 kilometers per second. It's a huge drop because they're given with errors of only fractions of decimal points of error. And yet, all over the world, it dropped, and they were all getting values very similar to each other with tiny errors. Then in 1945, it went up, 48, it went up again. And then people started getting very similar values again. I was very intrigued by this, and I couldn't make sense of it. So I went to see the head of metrology at the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington. Metrology is the science in which people measure constants. And I asked him about this. I said, what do you make of this drop in the speed of light between 1928 and 1945? And he said, oh dear, he said, you've uncovered the most embarrassing episode in the history of our science. So I said, well, could the speed of light have actually dropped And that would have amazing implications if so. He said, no, of course it couldn't have actually dropped. It's a constant. So, well then how do you explain the fact everyone was finding it going much slower during that period? Is it because they were fudging their results to get what they thought other people should be getting, and the whole thing was just produced in the minds of physicists? He said, we don't like to use the word fudge. I said, well, what do you prefer? He said, well, we prefer to call it intellectual phase locking. So I said, well, if it was going on then, how can we be so sure it's not going on today? And that the present values are produced by intellectual phase locking. And he said, we know that's not the case. I said, how do we know? He said, we've solved the problem. And I said, well, how? He said, well, we fixed the speed of light by definition in 1972. So I said, but it might still change. He said, yes, but we'd never know it because we've defined the meter in terms of the speed of light. So the units had changed with it. So he looked very pleased about that. They'd fixed that problem. But I said, well, then what about big G, the gravitational constant known in the trade as big G? It's written with a capital G, Newton's universal gravitational constant. That's varied by more than 1.3% in recent years. And it seems to vary from place to place and from time to time. And he said, well, those are just errors. And unfortunately, there are quite big errors with big G. So I said, well, what if it's really changing? I mean, perhaps it is really changing. And then I looked at how they do it. What happens is they measure it in different labs. They get different values on different days, and then they average them. And then other labs around the world do the same, and they come out usually with a rather different average. And then the International Committee on Metrology meets every 10 years or so and average the ones from labs around the world to come up with the value of big G. But what if G were actually fluctuating? What if it changed? There's already evidence, actually, that it changes throughout the day and throughout the year. What if the Earth, as it moves through the galactic environment, went through patches of dark matter or other environmental factors that could alter it? Maybe they all change together. What if these errors are going up together and down together? For more than 10 years, I've been trying to persuade metrologists to look at the raw data. In fact, I'm now trying to persuade them to put it online on the internet with the dates and the actual measurements and see if they're correlated, to see if they're all up at one time, all down at another. If so, they might be fluctuating together, and that would tell us something very, very interesting. But no one has done this. They haven't done it because G is a constant. There's no point looking for changes. You see, here's a very simple example of where a dogmatic assumption actually inhibits inquiry. I myself think that the constants may...
Amazing clip by Rupert Sheldrake talking about how scientists have invented these things like the constant of the speed of light and the constant of gravity, where all the evidence seems to indicate they're not actually constants at all. So we need to take our current science with a grain of salt, so to speak, because they really don't know as much as they pretend to. You're listening to Ohio Exopolitics. I'm your host, Mark Snyder. Have a good week.